Okay, let's talk about our fat cell here. Somebody consuming too much sugar, too many carbs, blood sugar goes up, insulin goes up, the fat cell's getting this glucose deposited within
And
it.
fatty acids, right?
Okay, explain that part, the fatty acid on top of that.
So the fatty acids will be in the LDL or in the VLDL, the triglyceride, either or. And the glucose will be, on its own, glucose circulating. And the insulin will stimulate the GLUT4 transporter for glucose to get across into the fat cell. And then that glucose can be turned into triglyceride in the fat cell to increase fat stores. In addition, the insulin will stimulate another enzyme on the fat cell called lipoprotein lipase. And that enzyme will snarf and soak up and suck up circulating lipid off LDL and VLDL and throw it into the cell, where it then gets turned into triglyceride as well. So you have two different transport mechanisms in the fat cell, and both are insulin driven. The GLUT4 transporter is insulin driven, and lipoprotein lipase is insulin driven. The GLUT4 transporter is for the glucose. The lipoprotein lipase is for the fat. Either way, you're making more fat. So insulin's really good at making fat.
Well, let's take this story even further. Somebody's doing this over a long period of time. Fat cells are continuing to get bigger and bigger. That is the body's natural way of storing energy. When does that become problematic?
Right. So how much fat is too much fat? That's the question you're asking. Well, first remember that there are 3 fat depots in the body. Okay, the fat depot that you're thinking about right now, and that we'll talk about this moment, is the subcutaneous or big butt fat. But there are 2 other fat depots that we have to deal with, and we'll do that after. Okay, the other 2 are the visceral fat or the big belly fat, and also the liver fat. So we have big butt fat, big belly fat, and liver fat, and they're not all the same. They have different qualities, they have different regulatory mechanisms, they have different stimuli, and they have different blood supplies, and they all do different things for your body or against your body.
Before you get into this, let me set the scene. We're taking in too much energy. The body's storing fat. You've talked about these 3 different areas that it can go into. Does it go into one before the others?
Which fat depot it goes into depends on the metabolic status of the individual at the time the fat came in, that the energy came in. So I can't answer that question because everybody's different at different times of the day and at different points in their life, and it's much more complicated than one takes precedence over the other. Now, if you are insulin sensitive, the preferential storage place will be the subcutaneous or big butt fat. So in an insulin sensitive person, subcutaneous fat will get the energy first. Okay. Now, how much fat can you gain before your subcutaneous fat becomes a problem? There is a limit. Everyone has a limit. And once you go above that limit, then you start getting into problems. On average, about 10 kilos, 22 pounds. So most people, when they're insulin sensitive, can gain 22 pounds and show no signs of metabolic mayhem. But at a certain point, you reach an asymptote, a peak. And at that peak, things then start to decompensate. So why do they decompensate? Your fat cells snarfing fat or glucose into the fat cell and building fat, and the fat droplet, the fat vacuole, gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And so your fat grows. Your fat cells don't grow. Okay. Your fat cells don't multiply, they grow. Okay. You don't make more fat cells, you grow the fat cells you have. So the fat vacuole in each fat cell gets bigger and bigger. And at a certain point, the perilipin border that circles that fat vacuole where the fat's been placed can't stretch wide enough. Kind of like a balloon. Okay. Every balloon has a point at which it can't hold the air anymore and it bursts. Well, kind of like that for a fat vacuole. You put so much in, you put so much in, you put so much in, it gets bigger, 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 bigger. And finally, the perilipin border can't hold it all. And when that happens, it starts leaking. And then the fat that should be in the fat vacuole now ends up in the cytoplasm of that cell. And that chokes off the cell. And now that cell will die. You have killed that fat cell. Well, now you have basically a grease problem. Okay, you got to clear the grease. Okay, so what do? You recruit that dead fat cell with all those with all those fatty acids that have now spilled out and have killed that cell. Okay, that has to ultimately be you have to call in the cleanup crew. And that's the macrophages. And so that recruits the macrophages to come and chew up all that grease and, get it out of the body. Okay. In the process, those macrophages secrete cytokines, which basically bring more macrophages. And so now you've got a whole inflammatory process going on. And then those macrophages, those cytokines end up in the bloodstream. And the level of the cytokines like TNF-alpha and IL-6 will go up. The question is, do they go up to the point where they start affecting other organs? And the answer is, it depends on how much fat you're dealing with. And it also depends on the volume of distribution of the liquid, which happens in this case to be blood. So the volume of distribution of the peripheral, blood system of your body, which is, basically, all the blood, is 6 liters. Okay. So you're basically increasing protein concentrations, these inflammatory proteins in the blood, and you're putting it into a 6-liter volume. Well, 6 liters is a lot of blood. And so you have to generate a huge increase in those cytokines before it will reach a concentration that will ultimately affect the liver or affect the brain or affect some other part of the body in a negative fashion. So, in general, your subcutaneous fat can expand by about 10 kilos before the amount of cytokines that are generated by those, dying fat cells reach a point that it causes metabolic mayhem. Okay? That's where your body wants to put the fat, put the extra energy. Now, there are 2 other places. There's the visceral fat and there's the liver fat. So let's talk about each one of those separately now. Visceral fat. What drives visceral fat accumulation? What drives big belly fat accumulation? Answer: not calories. The answer is cortisol. Now, how do we know that? Okay, because in general, big belly fat goes up when big butt fat goes up too. They go up together. Okay, it's rare for one to be separate from the other, but it happens, and that's the key. Is when does it happen that the big belly fat goes up and the big butt fat goes down? And the answer is depression. Depression, major depressive disorder. So there are patients who are admitted to the hospital to keep themselves from themselves. Okay, they are suicidal. They are major depressive disorder, life has lost all meaning and they want to die. Okay? And we have to admit them to the hospital, emergently, usually, to basically prevent suicide. You take those people, they're not eating, they're anhedonic. They derive no pleasure from food. They are losing weight. Major depressive disorder results in weight loss. It's one of the questions on the Beck Depression Inventory. Do you have weight loss? And the reason is because people who are depressed don't eat. They're losing weight. But you stick them in a scanner, and it turns out their visceral fat's going up. At the same time, their subcutaneous fat is going down. So if visceral fat were due to food, that wouldn't be happening. Visceral fat is due to cortisol. Cortisol increases visceral fat accumulation. And anything that increases your stress is going to increase your visceral fat. Why does this happen? Because your visceral fat is much easier to lift the fat out of than the subcutaneous fat. Subcutaneous fat is kind of stuck there. It's very hard to lift it out. That's why women find it so hard to lose that big butt even when they're dieting. Okay? They'll lose it from their belly, but they won't lose it from their butt, because subcutaneous fat is much harder to fish it out. Metabolically active fat is the visceral fat. And so when you're in a stress situation, that's your go-to in terms of getting energy, is the visceral fat. And the reason is because the visceral fat drains directly into the liver, drains through the portal vein. Remember, we talked about the volume of distribution being 6 liters for the subcutaneous fat? Well, for visceral fat, the volume of distribution is about 250 cc's, quarter of a liter. So 6 liters, a quarter of a liter, 24 times the concentration. So when you start accumulating visceral fat, those cytokines come, and they're releasing those cytokines into the portal circulation, and the concentration is 24 times greater because the volume of distribution of the portal system is way smaller than the volume of the general systemic circulation. And that means that your liver and your brain are going to see higher levels of cytokines for a smaller amount of fat that's been accumulated. And so visceral fat is much more potent as a driver of metabolic disease than is subcutaneous fat. Visceral fat is a much bigger problem. And that's why stress is such an issue in our society, because it's generating visceral fat. And then finally, we have number 3, liver fat. Now, liver fat, what makes liver fat? 2 things: sugar and alcohol. Sugar and alcohol make liver fat. Does dietary fat make liver fat? Nah. What about other foods? Branched chain amino acids can make liver fat too. So leucine, isoleucine, valine. So shall we say low quality protein. Branched chain amino acids, like what is in protein powder. So you need those to make muscle, but when you're not making muscle, then those end up becoming liver fat. Chris Newgard at Duke University demonstrated this very nicely, is that branched chain amino acids are part of the problem of liver fat. So what makes liver fat? Fructose, alcohol, and branched chain amino acids. You know what that's called? That's called ultra-processed food. So ultra-processed food drives calories, therefore subcutaneous fat. Okay. Does it drive visceral fat? Not specifically, except that people who are stressed often try to find solace in their stress by eating ultra-processed food. So it becomes an indirect driver because of the cortisol, which increases your appetite. And then finally, it generates liver fat directly. Now, how many kilos or pounds of liver fat can you store before you see metabolic mayhem?
I would be guessing. I'll say 1/4 pound.
Half a pound. Half a pound. Okay, 1/4 of a kilo, half a pound. So 22 pounds of subcutaneous fat equals about 4 pounds of visceral fat equals about half a pound of liver fat in terms of causing problems, causing metabolic problems. So which is the worst?
Sounds like liver.
Liver fat's the worst. And what makes liver fat? Ultra-processed food.
And alcohol.
And alcohol. Well, that's ultra-processed. Okay, so it depends on which fat depot, it depends on what the driver is, and it depends on your metabolic status when it happens. So not a simple calculus. It's not something where you say, oh, this, then that. You have to know who the patient is, and that will tell you where the fat's going to go.
All right, that was brilliant. I want to follow up in a lot of different areas here. Starting with visceral fat. So we know cortisol is the root cause there. But if somebody is taking in a lot of carbs, a lot of sugar, is there some overspill from subcutaneous fat? Now, I shouldn't say overfill because that's two different systems, but if the body's overwhelmed, can that build up with an abundance of energy as well, secondarily?
Oh, absolutely, because insulin will drive energy into visceral fat. But cortisol is the big driver. But remember, when you have high cortisol, you're going to eat a lot. That's what happens in Cushing's syndrome. Okay, Cushing's syndrome is hypercortisolism, and you end up with this enormous big belly. You end up with muscle wasting. You end up with thin arms and legs, but you end up with this huge big belly. And the reason is because the cortisol directed all the fat, all the energy to the visceral fat.
Okay, earlier you mentioned the fact that our fat cells with the subcutaneous, they don't actually multiply, they just grow in size. Isn't there
They
some
multiply,
of multiplication? Yeah, explain that.
They multiply till age 2.
Okay, so no multiplying once you're an adult.
Yeah, well, right. Basically, you're done. Now, having said that, fat cells don't multiply, but there are things called preadipocytes. Now, they look like fibroblasts, but they're preadipocytes. And in response to insulin and cortisol, those preadipocytes can turn into fat cells. So in that way, you can grow your fat. But it's not because they divided. They're already there. They're just kind of stringy little wispy things until they get hit with the hormones that basically get them to, finish their differentiation. And then so they can become fat cells. But there's no cell division that goes on past age 2. So they're kind of like adipocytes in abeyance. They're kind of like, emergency adipocytes. But they're there. They're just not dividing. They're waiting to be ballooned up by the right hormonal environment. Kind of like having a spare tire that doesn't have any air in it. It's there. God forbid you should need it, but you got to put some air in it for it to work.
If you enjoyed that clip, you're going to want to head over here and catch the full episode. I'll see you over there.
Insulin is the bad guy. I can't say it any simpler than that. Yes, glucose is bad too. I'm not saying it's not. Insulin's worse. Insulin is associated with all of the